Hello, everyone, and welcome to How to Handle a Furlough. Just as a reminder, this is a consumer focused webinar, so it doesn't qualify for CEUs, but we're really excited you're here. And I think there's a lot of great information that you will enjoy. So I will let Barb get started.
Okay, I'm very glad to be here and to present this webinar, which was kind of the outgrowth of some blog posts and some articles that I had actually written when I was with Rutgers Cooperative Extension a decade ago, because we were dealing with a lot of furloughs in the wake of the Great Recession. And I thought I'd start out with a little bit of trivia. I was reading an article in the Wall Street Journal last week, and it said that for the month of April, the most frequently searched word on Google was furlough. So just as these were taking hold in the country, a lot of people were looking up the word furlough, finding out what they were, what to do about it. In case you're interested, some of the other words that they searched for were gap year, because a lot of college students and high school students are making alternative plans. And the third one I thought was kind of cute was banana bread, because apparently a lot of people bought a lot of bananas when things started to happen and it got soft and people had to make bread out of them. So anyway, furloughs are definitely in the news, and I thought it would be a really great time to do this presentation. We heard last week on April 30th that 30 million people were jobless in this country in less than 2 months. And that obviously set all sorts of records. And then today, some of the official unemployment figures came out, and 20.5 million American jobs were lost in April. And the estimated unemployment rate is 14.7%, which is the highest since the Bureau of Labor Statistics started keeping track of that data in 1948. So among those millions of people that are being counted in the unemployment statistics are people who have been furloughed. And I couldn't find an exact number as the breakdown as to how many people were actually laid off and lost a job completely versus furloughed. But I've got to think that it has to be in the millions and millions of people. What we have seen was described by Dr. Fauci on Easter Sunday as an historic ordeal that we're going through, with the speed and scale of job loss that's unprecedented in this country. Just before, I was listening to a report on CNN. They were talking about depression level numbers and years of job growth that have been obliterated in about 2 months. So furloughs are definitely part of the picture. And what I want to do today is just talk a little bit about characteristics of furloughs, some associated topics like unemployment benefits, and then we'll go into a 10-step plan as to how to handle a furlough. So let's get started. What is a furlough? Well, a furlough is a temporary reduction in work hours and pay. Usually these only happen when there's some kind of economic shock, either to a particular company, something relating to its business model perhaps, or something like COVID-19 or the Great Recession where it's affecting large numbers of people. And the difference between a layoff, which is the total loss of a job, and a furlough is that technically when you're on furlough, you are still employed. You're still counted as an employee of the company. You're just not getting paid at that time, or maybe you're getting partial pay. I'll talk about the two different types of furloughs. Your employee benefits may or may not continue, and we'll talk more about that later. A lot of it has to do with insurance contracts and union contracts and those sorts of things. So they can be very case specific between different companies. And then again, the term that's often used as a descriptor of a furlough is a temporary layoff, indicating that there's an expectation that workers will be called back at some point in time. And we've seen furloughs a lot related to industry changes. When there's a slowdown like in auto industries or something like that, we've often seen temporary layoffs. So there's two different types of furloughs that are out there. There's the full furlough, And we're seeing a lot of those these days, where people are literally not being told any kind of timeline. So they basically are just not having any work and therefore not getting any pay at all for an indefinite period of time, until things get better. And of course, the problem with COVID-19 is we don't know when things are going to get better. We don't know when the vaccine or therapies that are effective are going to be developed. We don't know how fast supply and demand factors will factor into the economy. So there's just a whole lot of unknowns. So an example that's close to where I live now in Florida is Disney furloughing about 100,000 theme park and hotel workers. So that took place last month, and that's part of those 20.5 million jobs that are reported in the official figures. And then there's also what we call partial furlough. And we saw these quite a bit in the wake of the Great Recession in 2008, 2009, because we didn't have a health crisis then. We had a financial crisis, but there were many people in 2008, 2009 who were able to continue to work, and they still went out to restaurants, and then we didn't have any of the issues that we're dealing with today as far as social distancing. But demand wasn't exactly where it was. So many workers were told, okay, you have to skip X number of work days, and then obviously you don't get paid on those days. And then maybe there was a defined period of time. So an example might be that you would take 35 unpaid days without getting paid over the next 12 months. So an example of this, that's current example, is the University of Arizona has implemented a furlough program for their faculty and staff for the remainder of 2020 and into 2021 through the end of the academic year. And what they've done is they've based the amount of furlough days on a worker's salary range. So what they've basically done is they said anybody that works that earns $1 up to $44,499 gets 13 furlough days, which is equivalent to about 5% of pay. The next increment of income gets up to 26 furlough days, which is equivalent to 10% loss of pay. 75,000 to 150,000 gets 39 days, and that's up to 15% of their pay. And then interestingly, what they did with the higher earned people at University of Arizona is that those people get a pay reduction, but not a furlough. So they're expected to work their same full-time hours, but they'll be working for less pay. But of course, these are people who have higher earnings. So employers will structure furloughs in many different ways. And again, a lot of it's going to be depending on the products and services that they provide, their expected revenue streams. Obviously, a state university, which is receiving tuition and state funding, is a whole lot different than a theme park, and their furlough policies are going to vary accordingly. So I'd like to start out with a question before we really get into the topic is, have you or anyone that you know, a family member, been furloughed? And if you would just tell us in the chat, yes or no. And if you want to describe anything about the furlough, if you know, if you know a time period, if you know a number of days, if you don't really know anything about how long the furlough is going to last, if you just take a minute or so to put that in the chat, to let us know if anybody has had an experience, again, with somebody that they know or themselves. So I'll give you a minute to do that. And I'm not seeing, so Dr. James is saying yes, she's not sure about all the exact details. Christine's saying yes. Jerry, all the trainers at his gym were furloughed. Angela has a family member. Darlette, no, okay. Um, Lisa, federal employee, furloughed, okay. Teenage son, family member. So we're seeing a lot of yeses here. I have a family member, my brother-in-law, he's not furloughed, he's actually lost his job, and the company that he was working for was pretty marginal on the edges, and I guess they're just going to disband the company, so there won't be any coming back to a job because it's a full layoff. VA contractors, service industries. Okay, so most of you have somebody that you know or yourselves that have been affected by furloughs, which makes this presentation all the more personal to all of you. So let's talk about why furloughs exist and what the benefits are to employers. First of all, employers are shedding their payroll costs. So you've got theme parks that aren't open, restaurants. You can't afford to keep paying your payroll when you don't have income coming in from the service or the business that you provide. So they're reducing payroll, flexibility to manage labor costs, because again, everything that I'm hearing is suggesting that when the economy comes back, it's going to be very bumpy and it's likely to be at reduced capacity. So people may be called back in waves, and furloughs give employers the ability to do that. It also reduces the administrative costs of terminating workers, because technically, if you're on furlough, you are still an employee. And then from the business perspective, it also helps when companies are starting up from scratch, because onboarding is expensive. You know, hiring people and training them, that whole process that we call onboarding, getting all their paperwork in order, you know, for retirement benefits and health, all of that process is very expensive and time consuming. So if people are still on your roster, so to speak, as employees, then you can onboard in a much easier way. It's also considered a more humane way to treat your workers, because you're just not outright laying them off or firing them. You're giving them an act of hope. And that's really what a furlough is. It's an act of hope that the business will survive, but there aren't any guarantees that a furlough can't turn into a layoff later, especially now with COVID-19, because there's just so many uncertainties as to when the economy will recover, and even individual businesses when they will recover. It's also, in a way, an act of compassion, because it's allowing employees to access some of the expanded unemployment benefits that are out there as well. And I don't know if you saw the article in the Wall Street Journal last week, but there was an article that said half of workers get more pay laid off than they were working previously at their jobs. So those are some of the reasons why employers want to have furloughs as an alternative to laying people off. What are the benefits to workers? Well, again, technically you're still employed and you've got that hope that you will be recalled back to your job. Your health care benefits may continue, but again, it's very employer specific. So you'll need to get the best guidance that you can from a union if you have one, from your HR department. A lot of this, when I was doing the research for this presentation, a lot of this continuation of benefits is based on terms of group plan contracts, you know, because you have group insurance at your workplace, based on terms in flexible spending accounts. So you have to really read the fine print, union contracts. And then, of course, a big one too will be how easily and how quickly the business comes back when they're able to open up. And we're seeing some states now that are letting limited types of businesses open, and most people are predicting it's going to be very slow and gradual. It's not going to be like flipping a switch where all of a sudden all your customers come back. So that's an issue. Other benefits that you might also want to find out about would be things like life and disability insurance. And again, that would also be determined probably by contracts and documents that are related to employee benefits. Something like that is going to be something to find out about. Also, I think a benefit to workers is that you may feel more valued and less abandoned. than if you were laid off, because again, you've got that hope, you've got that feeling that you're still an employee. Obviously, COVID 19 hit everybody, kind of like as a whack across the side of the head. And, your employers were blindsided just as much as workers were. And just feeling like there's a possibility I can come back. Because so many of us identify with our jobs, and it's just like people leaving a job when maybe they're fired or they're laid off. You feel abandoned. It's not just the loss of the income. It's your identity. It's your structure to your day, and that's important for a lot of people. And then often you are eligible for unemployment benefits, and we'll talk more about that when we get into unemployment. Some of the disadvantages to people as far as being furloughed is, first of all, the pay cut, obviously, because you either have no pay if it's a full furlough and your employer has just shut down, like Disney, or you've got partial pay, in the example of University of Arizona, where you have X number of days that you won't be getting a paycheck for. So obviously the pay cut is a big disadvantage. Also, and I've mentioned this before, I'll mention it again, there is no guarantee that a furloughed worker will get rehired, or even the order of when people will be rehired, especially initially, especially now with all of the uncertainty that we have as far as businesses coming back. And I've heard some stories where restaurants have to be at 25 to 50% of capacity. And obviously, that means customers that you're not earning income from, and you don't need to have as many waiters and waitresses for a half empty restaurant versus a full one. I like this quote from Mark Zandi, who's a leading economist. He kind of stated it's like playing musical chairs with fewer chairs when a business first starts back up. So you might have had 100 chairs initially in the game. Now you might have 50 chairs. So what happens to the other 50 people who don't have chairs? It's kind of an interesting analogy. Um, Keep in mind too that another disadvantage, if you're on a full furlough like the Disney workers, you obviously can't contribute to retirement plans. Now, obviously, a lot of people probably wouldn't be able to do that anyway because their income's been cut, but you can't, because technically you have a salary reduction plan, and if you have no salary, you have no paycheck, there's nothing to take the contribution out of. And generally, the employees must pay the employee cost of their health insurance premiums. And that's opened kind of a sticky wicket in some situations, because employers have had to make rules and policies on this, because how do you get the insurance premium from workers if it's a full furlough and there's no paychecks? Typically premiums come out of a paycheck, but if there's no paycheck, what do you do? So, in some cases, employers are saying they'll make it up later when business resumes. In some cases, employers are sending their employees an invoice, basically, to send them a check, or put on a credit card or something, some way to get the payment back to the employer to cover the employee's share of the health insurance. So again, this is going to be very case specific with different work sites, but something that people need to be aware of, that if they're going to continue their health insurance, they're going to have to be paying their out of pocket probably, and will need to be doing that from a reduced income. So, some other points about furloughs. As I mentioned before, you may or may not have a return date or an end date. So our University of Arizona has indicated that their program is going from May 11th, 2020 to remain in effect until 2021, June 30th, 2021. So they do have kind of an end date, although they do state somewhere in their fine print that this could be changed again. And that's the thing, that dates can change with economic conditions. We've seen a lot of dates around health insurance where companies will say, we will keep our furloughed workers on their health benefits until a certain date. And then what happens when that date comes? And we'll talk a little bit about that some more when we talk about health benefits. But dates can change. with economic conditions, because nobody knows exactly how businesses are going to come back. Lost wages are usually not reimbursed later. So if you've lost, let's say, 6 weeks of work, you're probably not going to get it reimbursed. The only exception that we sometimes see is in government shutdowns, where budgets haven't been appropriated at a timely date and workers are furloughed, and then eventually they pass the budget. There may be some reimbursement, but again, that depends case by case on the government itself, the entity that we're talking about. There can be morale issues, especially if workers perceive inequitable treatment. So if different classes of workers are called back before others, whether it's based on differences in demographics, job titles, income levels, any number of things, that can cause some issues. Also, in the case of the partial furloughs, a big morale issue would be the people who are left, because on certain days you might only have half of a crew instead of a full crew. Um, there's more work being dumped on a smaller number of people, and that could be an issue as well for morale. Occasionally, we'll see some voluntary furloughs, and we saw some of that in the Great Recession, where companies actually put it out there to the employees and said, we'll take some volunteers. And sometimes it just happens to work for people's work-life balance. Let's say where maybe at a particular time they would be willing to do that. So you sometimes will see voluntary furloughs, and sometimes employers are able to get the number of positions that they need temporarily removed from their payroll through a voluntary effort. But typically, furloughs, as we're seeing them today, are mandated. They're just coming down from the company and saying, "This is our policy. This is what we have to do." Okay, let's talk about unemployment. Let me look at some of the things in the chat here before I move on to that. I see Jerry's comment about avoiding the costs, and you've got a helpful link there. So thank you for sharing that, Jerry. Okay, so furloughed workers are eligible for unemployment. So some of the things to keep in mind are that you have to apply in the state where you work, not in the state where you live if it's different. For example, I came from New Jersey, and we bordered Pennsylvania, and a lot of people who worked in New Jersey lived in Pennsylvania because the living costs were a lot less, that sort of thing. But you have to apply in the state where you work because your employer is paying for unemployment insurance benefits in that state where the company is headquartered. So that's something to keep in mind. And hopefully you'll be getting some guidance from your HR department as to how to do that. And of course, the online systems as well. You can go to that state's unemployment system and their website and get information as well. Now, the thing about unemployment is that the benefits can vary quite a bit. Just like we have living costs in the country that vary, we've got high cost states, New Jersey, where I came from, as an example, and then we've got lower cost states. So benefits will vary from state to state. The national average was $378 a week, but $213 a week in Mississippi, $555 in Massachusetts. Those would be the lowest and the highest points. So it can vary from state to state as to the benefit that you're going to receive. And then another key thing that people need to be aware of, and we have to make sure that people themselves know, and anybody who is advising people knows to tell them, is that unemployment insurance is taxable. So if you're going to be getting a benefit this year in 2020, expect that early next year you'll be getting a 1099-G form, and this is going to be reporting your unemployment benefits for the year. And then you'll have to take those unemployment benefits and add them to Schedule 1 of the 1040 form. That's the place on that form where you will report that income that's coming in from unemployment benefits. So you need to have either a way to withhold that money, and again, that's where you would try to do that when you're applying for benefits, or if not, it probably is very prudent to try to save about 25% of the benefit that you'll be receiving, and just set it aside, put it in a savings account, because you're going to need to have that money. Ideally, what you'll probably want to do is pay the quarterly estimated payments. And if the furlough goes on for any period of time, get that money sent to the IRS through the quarterly payments. And they have been postponed for the first 2 quarters of this year. Typically, first quarter is due April 15th, second quarter is due June 15th. Now they've been pushed back to July 15th with the CARES Act. So you have to have that money set aside or it'll sneak up on you next year. And then the other thing that is very state specific, so I can't speak generally for everyone, is that state laws vary on the benefits that you will receive for a partial furlough pay reduction. So let's say you're still working, 4 days a week, and you're taking one unpaid day a week off, which is a 20% loss of your pay if you've lost one day a week of income. That may be a trigger for some states. In other words, if you're only losing a very small amount of money through a furlough from your income, you may not qualify. But again, you've got to check with your state, because I can't speak generally on this, because all I could find in the literature is that every state is different as far as how they're handling unemployment benefits for people who are on partial furloughs, like the University of Arizona example. Latrice is saying, can they have it taken out as they are getting their employment checks? Yeah, if the state allows that, and if you sign up for it. So that's something that you want to be cognizant of. I would, if I were in that situation today, I would be looking up the FAQs on the state unemployment system to find out how to do that, and well, if you can do it and how you can do it, because it's a whole lot easier to have the withholding taken out. You may need to file some version of a W-4 form or something. I don't know. Every state is different, but ideally have it taken out of the check. But if not, then you're going to have to set that money aside, pay the estimated payments quarterly, so that you're not under withheld next year and subject to under withholding penalties, plus the shock of having to come up with a lot of money all at once. Okay, let's move on and talk a little bit about the CARES Act and how this kind of plays into it. I will mention that AFCPE has done 2 webinars already about the nuances of the CARES Act. So if you really want to delve into the weeds of the CARES Act, Ryan Law, who's the AFCPE president right now, did a great job in 2 webinars of really delving into the CARES Act, all different parts of it, as it affects workers and anybody that was affected by that. So what I'll just talk about here is just a few things that affect unemployment benefits. First of all, the big thing is that $600 a week was the enhanced federal benefit that was placed on top of whatever a person's regular state unemployment benefit would be. And again, remember, those can vary quite a bit across the country, as I mentioned. And that will happen until July 31st of 2020. So it's going to go away in a few months. But for now, anybody who gets unemployment assistance will get that extra $600 of benefits. Also, the benefit period has been extended. States had different maximums of time that benefits would be paid for. But what the CARES Act did was to extend the maximum time for people in all states to a maximum of 39 weeks. The other thing that the CARES Act did is that it addressed the issues germane to COVID-19, particularly when people are leaving a job voluntarily. Typically with unemployment, if we weren't in the middle of this pandemic, people who voluntarily leave a job would not be eligible for unemployment because you did it of your own accord. It wasn't the employer telling you you can't work, it was you walking away from your job. But what the CARES Act did is it expanded eligibility for unemployment benefits to include anybody who's in a self quarantine situation. So that's typically 14 days, but then you might have to get retested again, and that might take some time. And, it could be maybe a month with the whole process to cycle through. Also, if you're caring for a family member who's been diagnosed, and unfortunately, we've had 76,000 people who've died already in this country due to COVID-19. So, obviously, anybody who's taking care of a family member who's hospitalized, trying to fight this terrible virus. And then also, if you're caring for children who are unable to attend school because they've closed their schools. So they've put in some of those exceptions. Now, the big thing that's kind of the elephant in the room that, again, I can't address like across the board because, again, it's very state specific because unemployment benefits are state specific, is people are asking the questions now. Okay, maybe I'm not diagnosed, my family member's not diagnosed, the children's issue isn't an issue for me. I'm just plain afraid to go back to work until something has been developed to take care of this virus or new protocols have been put into place. And that is just a real sticky wicket. And it's being addressed more now because more states are starting to open up some of their policies and telling different groups of companies that, okay, it's okay for you to open up right now. But people can be very hesitant. And again, I would just direct you back to a union if you have one, an HR department, or your state unemployment benefits office for advice as to handle those situations. There have been a few states that have said basically that um, if you get called back to work and you don't show up, you will lose your benefits. Other states have not done that yet. So again, it's a very case by case kind of situation. The other thing that the CARES Act did is it waived the typical 1 week period for waiting for benefits. Typically, states would have a 1 week waiting period before your first benefit check would kick in, and that hasn't taken. That was waived this year, so that's not taking place right now. One thing that I did find in the literature that I would pass along is a recommendation that if you are staying home because of a quarantine order or staying caring for a family member or a child, put it in writing to your employer and document it so that it's clearly on record that you are staying home because of one of these issues related to the CARES Act. I found that was really important. The other thing that I found in the literature is that some states, even though they've waived the job search requirement, that's another thing that they've done, is you don't have to prove every week that you've been out looking for a job because the legislators clearly anticipated that there's not going to be that many jobs to be looking for with all these businesses closed. So that has been waived. However, in some states, they are still requiring people who are getting benefits to update their unemployment status. So, in other words, once a week, you may still have to go in and check a box that says, I'm still unemployed, but you don't have to check a box that's saying, I've been out looking for a job, at least during this pandemic situation. So, that's something to consider. So those are some of the key highlights as far as how furloughs kind of coordinate with unemployment information and the CARES Act. So I don't know if we have any questions about that. I'm not seeing anything right now. But do know that furloughs are covered and that you've got these extra protections from the CARES Act, and then just be paying particular attention to any information coming down the pike. Okay, so what do we do? You've been told that you're furloughed. What do? You make a plan. Anytime you have information that's coming into to you, negative information like this in personal finance, you need to kind of organize your thoughts, set some priorities, make some plans, and then take some action. So that's what we're going to talk about is what to do. So the first thing, and this would apply only to people who have a partial furlough. So if you've been told that you have to skip X number of work days over a period of time, and so you have so many days that you're not going to get paid, first of all, what you need to do is figure out what do you earn in a day after taxes. So the best way to do that is just take your gross income, whatever your annual gross in is, and that can be tricky for a lot of people who don't have a steady income. We know that about 3 in 10 workers in this country have volatile incomes. So I don't know exactly how you're going to do that. Probably your best estimate that you can get working off of maybe a tax return, something like that, because your paychecks prior to being furloughed may have been all up and down and across the board. But somehow you're going to have to get the best guesstimate you can get of your annual gross income divided by 260, which is the number of work days that you have in a year. That will tell you your gross pay for a day of work. And then what you want to do is take that and multiply it by your marginal tax rate. So in the example that I gave on the slide, if you earned $154 in a day and you were in the 22% marginal tax bracket, 22% of 154 would be 34. So your after-tax income would be $120 per day. And then what you want to do is multiply that, because that's the money you would have seen, by the number of unpaid days. So with University of Arizona, they're talking about their highest number of days there would be 39. So, but that's stretched over 2 years. So you might want to figure how many will be in 2020 and how many would be in 2021. How many unpaid days in each year? That gives you a number. So in the example on the slide, you've got $120 a day that you've lost in net pay times 20 unpaid days is $2,400. And this is approximate because it doesn't consider things that might be state specific here, like state income tax. Some states take out workers temporary disability benefits and state unemployment insurance, and you may have some other things taken out as well, but it'll give you an approximate figure. And then you know what you're dealing with. Then you know that you're dealing with a loss of, in this case, $2,400. It gives you something concrete and specific that you can plan around. Okay, then you want to get as much information as possible. So to the extent that knowledge is available, and again, it can be changing, as I said, what is announced today can be very different than what's announced in June, depending on what happens with the economy and individual companies. You want to find out when the furlough will start, how long it will last, if you have any choice of days taken. And by the way, I did get into some research, and what it's indicated is that the best way that a furlough can be a win-win for employers and employees in a difficult situation is that workers have as much advance notice as possible, and they also have as much choice if possible in the days that they can take off. Again, we're talking about partial furloughs here. So if you have any choice, that would be something you'd want to find out. How long your employee benefits will last, if you're going to have any employee benefits that will be paid, and how long. And again, that can change. Some companies were saying that they will provide health insurance through the end of May. Maybe they'll come back in June and say, we can't do this anymore. So you'll have to keep up to date on that. Find out the process for paying your health insurance premiums, if you have to pay back to the company what would have been taken out of a paycheck if you had one. You'll want to find out the processes for borrowing from your employer retirement savings plans if you need to do that. Uh, and any other employer specific policies. You want to get as much information as you possibly can from as many sources as you can. The other good place to seek information is 211, because you may be looking at reaching out to local resources. And maybe you've never had to do that before. There have been so many cases that have been profiled on television of people who have had financial stability for most of their lives, and then all of a sudden COVID-19 has come in, blown away their income, and now they're reaching out to agencies for assistance. They're going to food pantries, they're applying for benefits. So a real good source of information for that is 211. So you can either dial 211 on your cell phone, it's like 911 for human services, or you can go to 211.org and put in the name of the community that you're seeking information about. And you should be able to get a really good list of services that are available. So any of you who are on the webinar today who are financial practitioners can do that to be able to help your clients. And any of you who are on the webinar today because you've been furloughed, you can do that for yourselves. So 211.org is a great resource for resources in your community that can provide utility assistance, food banks, and any other human service needs. Obviously, spending comes into play. So you'll want to reduce your spending by the amount of lost income if you possibly can. You're going to have to redo your spending plan, taking into account reduced income. Also, changed expenses. You may have some expenses that you've been able to cut completely. If you're not driving to work, you obviously don't have gasoline and tolls and commuting related things. Childcare may be paused, although I've heard from some parents who've told me that they are still paying childcare while their kids are at home, and they're at home because they're trying to preserve their spot in some places, because if they don't keep paying the provider, they'll lose the slot for childcare, and in some communities those slots are really hard to come by. um, so that may be an expense that continues, but maybe not, or maybe it's only half of the amount that you were paying before. So whatever the numbers are, you need to get them down on paper. Also, if you're going to be taking advantage of any of the moratoriums and suspensions that are part of the CARES Act, for example, the suspension of paying student loan debt payments through the end of September, those kinds of things, you want to factor all of those changes that are taking place to your income and your expenses into a new spending plan. And then start your expense cutting probably with anything that's a variable expense, because typically what we want to do is preserve our basic expenses. When push comes to shove, the first thing you prioritize is your basic needs, your housing, your food, your utilities, and any medical expenses that are a priority. After that, you have lower priorities and you might need to make some expense cuts. And then tracking becomes really important too. Many people don't do it in good times, but when we're in a tough time like this, it's a really good time to be thinking about tracking your income and expenses, just to get a read on what they are now versus what they might have been pre-COVID-19. Okay, then there's the voluntary deductions. And again, this is only for people who are experiencing a partial furlough, because if you are on full furlough, you don't have a paycheck. So there's nothing going to be deducted because there's no paycheck to deduct it from. But for those of you who are experiencing the partial situation, you are going to have that reduction of income, that example that I gave you before with the $2,400. So you may want to look at anything that's coming out of your paycheck that is voluntary. Obviously, you can't change the FICA tax or anything like that, but things that you might need to temporarily suspend or reduce would be things like charitable contributions, deposits to a credit union that's associated with your workplace, automated retirement plan deposits like TSP or 403B plans, 401ks, anything like that. And if you've been over withholding on your taxes, you may want to consider maybe having less tax taken out so you have more cash flow. Or if you want to continue the over withholding, then that can be useful to help pay the taxes that will be owed on your unemployment benefits next year. If you can seek a side hustle, try to do it. Maybe you already have a side hustle and you have the ability to ramp it up. If it's the type of work that can be done from home on a computer, where you're not face to face in any kind of industry that's really been hit hard by all the shutdowns, this might be a time to do it. Or maybe think about starting a new side hustle with your talents and skills. If it's computer expertise, even sewing. We've got a couple of cottage industries in the community where I live right now where people are just making COVID masks for their neighbors, and charging $5 a mask or something like that, just a nominal cost. So something like that possibly could be of benefit. Looking for growth opportunities in the poor economy, but of course there's that trade-off again, because many of those growth opportunities are in places where there could be risk to your health, and we need to acknowledge that as well. And then probably you want to make sure too that if you're furloughed, you're technically an employee. You'll probably need to respect any conflict of interest policies that your employer has, and also any non-compete contracts that you may have signed, which obviously could jeopardize your main job and going back to that job. I'd also add one more thing on side hustling that I have experienced personally, just from personal experience, and that's pay attention to your social media. I never did much with LinkedIn when I worked for Rutgers Cooperative Extension, but now that I'm a financial education entrepreneur, I pay a whole lot more attention to LinkedIn and posts and everything. And it's actually started to provide me with media speaking opportunities and at least one job right now. So that's a time maybe to ramp up some of your social media, make sure your resume is up to date, your profile is up to date, and see if that can generate some leads as well. You want to stay insured. So take advantage of your employer insurance continuation if they're going to be continuing health insurance for as long as it lasts. So typically the employers these days are giving dates. We will pay your health benefits until the end of May, for example. But also be thinking about what comes next. So find out how to pay the premiums without a paycheck. I talked about that before. But then what happens if you're not called back to work and the health benefits end? Then you basically have three choices. You've got Medicaid. I don't have that on the slide, but Medicaid would be a choice if you were qualified for Medicaid, because remember, Medicaid is a program with income and asset qualifications. But for some people, perhaps if they have lost a job, they may now qualify for Medicaid. So that's one option to be looking at. Another option would be COBRA, which is where you continue to pay your employer a premium. And this typically happens when people leave their job completely, if you're in a full furlough situation. And again, that might be something that's very company specific. I will mention, though, that COBRA is of no use if the company goes belly under. And I actually worked on a team years ago where there was a factory in the county where I was an extension agent. And we were brought in to help the workers of the team, and I was doing financial counseling. And we didn't have any Obamacare then. This is back in the 1990s. And what happened is the factory eventually just went under, and you can't be getting COBRA health insurance from a company when the company doesn't exist anymore. So most people are probably going to go with ACA, Affordable Care Act, or AKA Obamacare, particularly if you can qualify for a subsidy, which you may be able to do if you have no income because you've been furloughed. And this will typically be much more affordable than the COBRA benefit would be as well. So that's where you want to go to healthcare.gov and start poking around and looking at the options that are available. You're going to want to adjust your income taxes. So I've already talked about unemployment benefits. You'll probably want to complete a new W-4 form when you get rehired if you come back from a full furlough. Or if you're on a partial furlough, you'll want to do a new W-4 form to account for the reduced income that you calculated in step one, that you obviously won't be paying taxes on because you're not going to be earning that income that is part of your furlough days. And then also you may qualify for the first time for income-based tax credits that you wouldn't have qualified for previously when you had your full salary. So look into things like the Savors credit and the earned income tax credit that you would be taking on your 2020 taxes that would be filed in early 2021. You want to contact your creditors. Make sure that you're calling your creditors and utilities and explaining your reduction or your loss of income. Are so many leniency programs going on now, but again, you want to get there early. You want to get to your employer before you start having situation where you're missing payments. Ask for flexibility until you can get back on your feet. Make sure that you're only agreeing to repayment terms that you can afford. So you tell them what you can afford. Don't have them tell you something that's still not going to be affordable for you. And whenever you're dealing with anybody that is providing leniency regarding finances, you want to take good notes when you're talking to them and ask questions. Make sure you're asking about any fees that might be waived, any interest that might be postponed, new repayment terms. Try to take really good notes, and better still, summarize it back to them in a letter. You can email it to them, but make a letter, a PDF letter, and send it back to them. And just to be clear, I want to make sure that this is what we agreed to. Please confirm that this is correct so that you have no questions later that you agreed to certain terms. And then ask whether the delayed payments will be reported to credit bureaus. Typically, they shouldn't be, according to the CARES Act. And now we have leniency on credit reports where you can check them every week just to make sure there's no change in the status of your credit history. But it's always a good idea to, anytime you're dealing with delayed payments and making deals with creditors, always just make sure that you ask them how it's going to be reported, if it's going to be reported, and how it might be reported. Human capital. So one of the things that furloughs do provide is the gift of time. And I read a lot of expert recommendations that said, take advantage of this time. Don't just sit on the couch, binge watching whatever you're looking for, on television. Don't wait for a recall because you could be waiting 2, 3, 4 months. It could be a long time. Maybe you'll never be recalled. So what all the job experts are saying is take this time to upskill yourself, prepare yourself for your new position. It could be going back to your old position, or maybe it's a new position, or maybe you're going to be looking for a new employer at some point in time, maybe in a different industry. So that's anything from taking webinars, certification programs, for example, some of the ones that AFCP has, just saying. Even tinkering around with technology. I've been doing that a little bit lately, just trying new things that you never did before on a computer because you have a little bit more time perhaps. Looking at gaps in your skill set. I've just been learning this week a new program that a lot of teachers are using called Nearpod, which is a great way to do interactive presentations. And many teachers are using it now to teach virtually with their students. So I decided I wanted to kind of teach myself how to do Nearpod. So I now have that in my skill set. So what you want to do is try to make yourself as marketable to employers as possible so that you will be the first group of people who's called back, because you're going to be one of the most valued employees that they want to bring back to the work site as soon as they possibly can. And then the final thing too is just to savor the time, particularly if you're in the situation, the enviable situation where, at least for a temporary period of time till the end of July, you may actually have a little bit more income than you would have had when you were working. So some things to think about is resist the urge to work, and that's really important for people who are on partial furloughs. Employers will insist that if you are on partial furlough, that you do not do any work on those furlough days, and that includes work emails, phone calls. It is prohibited that you do that. And not to say that some people I know haven't done back channeling work on their own personal emails, but anything on the company email or phone system is prohibited. Just walk. Just enjoy the beautiful weather that we're getting into. Walking, not those of you that are getting snow, but many of us that are having better weather. So take advantage of that. Physical activity is so important for reducing stress and centering people. Maybe taking an online course, spending the extra time with family and friends. I've done more Zoom conversations now with friends and family than I've ever done, and it's just so much fun to take that time and connect with people. If you can't be physically present, you can we don't have to be socially distant, we just have to be physically distant, but we can be socially friendly. So building those relationships with people in your life is important. Maybe doing some of that binge watching that you've been meaning to do, even some things around the home for home maintenance. So I'm looking at Jacqueline's question. Yeah, you've got the second one is correct. Nearpod, Nearpod. Check it out. It's a neat platform to use. So I've kind of wrapped up the 10 steps. I think we have about 3 minutes left. I just wondered if anybody from your own situation, since some of you are experiencing a furlough right now, you've maybe been into it for a couple of weeks, anything that you would share to help others, and anything that has been an experience for you, resources perhaps. If you want to share that, that would be helpful. Even if you know any links to websites, that would be helpful as well. Um, but I think that's important. I would probably mention maybe support groups if you have a number of workers that are together. Maybe get together on a Zoom platform. I've been networking with a bunch of teachers that I work with through Next Gen Personal Finance. We get together on Saturday mornings, and it's just a way for people to check in. How are you doing? Sharing resources. Some of those things can be really valuable as an informal support system. And you do get 40 minutes for free on Zoom if you don't have the pro plan, but so you can pack a lot in those 40 minutes if you want to check in with people. Okay, okay, so Valerie has a link there on help with paying bills from USA.gov. Thank you for sharing that, Valerie. Appreciate that. I'll share a few other resources. I have a blog post that I wrote about furloughs, and actually I just put another one up yesterday. That's my current blog post for the week, and my blog post is called Money Talk, so you can just find that if you're interested, and it has a subscription feed on it. Wall Street Journal has had a couple of interesting articles, and the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and the New York Times have all waived their paywalls for articles related to coronavirus. So I think that's really helpful, even if you don't have subscription. I mean, they encourage you to subscribe, but you can still see their articles. So that's very helpful. CBS News had an article. And then the Wellness Society has a really good coronavirus anxiety workbook that I would highly recommend for people themselves that are going through furloughs, and also for practitioners who are assisting them, because there's a lot of neat worksheets in there. A worksheet where you identify what you can control and what you can't control. There's a gratitude worksheet. There are worksheets to develop a daily plan, because that's important too. When you're furloughed, you lose all the daily structure. So there's a worksheet where you can actually map out your day, very much like people who leave their jobs, after a long career and they're retired. And what do I do now? Well, there's this a worksheet to help do that. So I would recommend that as well. And one final thing I want to mention is that AFCPE has a wonderful program going on right now with the Yellow Ribbon Network and funded by Wells Fargo. And what they're basically doing is matching people who have been affected personally by COVID-19, and that certainly includes anybody with a furlough, with financial counselors. These are accredited financial counselors who hold the AFC credential through AFCPE. It's at no cost to the individual. And it's a great way to have somebody that can help you with all of the issues that are listed on the slide. So whether it's taxes, dealing with credit issues, fraud issues, debt, setting up a new budget, there are AFCs all around the country that can connect with you virtually to help you weather through this crisis. So I think at this point in time, unless there's any other questions or comments, I'm going to turn it back to Summer, and she'll close us out.
Thank you very much, Barb, and thank you all for attending. I'm sure you all caught this at the beginning, but just in case, this is not a CEU opportunity, so there's no completion code. I will get the slides and the recording link sent out probably this afternoon. Otherwise, I hope you guys have a great day, and Barb's contact was at the beginning if you need to ask her if you have any questions. So thank you very much, and have a great day, everyone.